Okay, so now that we are out here on the range, let's think about what we see when we take our rifle off and we aim at the target. Obviously, first, the thing you see is the rear sight. This is the large black circle that is closest to your eye. Looking forward now towards the end of the rifle, you see the front sight. You have the front sight and the aperture that is on the inside of it. So let's talk a little bit about good sight picture and what that actually means. For us as coaches, it's really hard for us to know if an athlete has good sight picture because obviously we cannot see what your eye sees when you're looking through the sights. So the question always comes up, what is good sight picture look like? How much light should there be between the front sight and the rear sight? Well, I'm going to show you a few examples and I'm going to give you my recommendation of what's been taught to me. You'll notice that when you slide the rear sight forwards and backwards, you'll get more light through that peephole. So this is an example of what it would look like if the sight was slid really far forward, closer towards the front sight, and this is what it would look like if it was slid really far backwards, really close to your eye. Now, there's a happy medium in here somewhere, and trying to find that is really specific to the individual athlete. My recommendation is always try to get it equal. And what I mean by that is there should be equal light between the aperture and the front sight as there is between the front sight and the rear sight. Something like this. Obviously, this is a drawing and might not be exactly to scale, but now that you understand the concept, you can see what works for you next time you're at the range. Now, there is a caveat that is really important when talking about sight alignment. All of these sight picture examples are spoken with the assumption that your cheek placement is consistent every time. Failing to have consistent cheek placement will make getting consistent sight alignment impossible. Just like how the new sight picture changes as you move the rear sight further and closer to your eye, the same effect will happen if you're moving your cheek and in turn your eye further and closer to the real sight. So getting quality, comfortable, and consistent position is a prerequisite to getting good sight alignment. So as a coach, I feel like people don't understand how important sight alignment is. So let's talk about that really quick. Let's first talk about too much light and why it's not good. When you have too much rear light, it can be hard for your eye to make concentric circles. And off the bat, that might not seem like too big of an issue, considering the target is still in the aperture. But if the rear sight is off its perfect concentric alignment by even 1 millimeter, it will result in a major miss by the time the bullet gets to the target. The graphic on the right is an over-exaggeration, but the math checks out. If you're really into numbers, check the description down below and I'll leave the exact calculations for those who are math nerds like me. So to put this into some perspective, if your rear sight is off its concentric circles by even 1 millimeter, your miss downrange will be off by 7.26 millimeters on the target. That's the difference between a perfect 10 ring hit and being in the 1 ring. Yes, in the white. So let's compare this to someone who has good sight picture but poor aiming. And please note, there is a pretty big difference between sight picture and aiming. Sight picture is what we were talking about here with making sure our rear sight and our front sight are concentric. Aiming is when you actually put the target in the center of your front aperture. So while this is an example of someone with poor aiming, their sight picture is still really good, and they are actually going to hit exactly where you see in the front of the aperture. Now let's talk about why it's important to not have too little light around the front sight. There's not much more to say here since we already talked about the importance of sight alignment, but not having enough light fights our brain's natural ability to create concentric circles. Too little light can make it too difficult to find that sweet spot. It's best to find that happy medium and let our brain subconsciously do the work. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about when it comes to sight alignment is the front aperture. The picture you see now is an example of a pretty standard 3.2 aperture, and it's what most coaches would recommend. In my opinion, I think it's best to err on the side of being too thin as opposed to too thick. Here's an example of an aperture that is on the thicker side. And like the rear sight that doesn't let enough light through, this aperture fights our brain's natural tendency to create concentric circles. Now, I'm often asked, what size aperture do I use? I have a special aperture that was made by a guy with a machine shop in Maine. Here's what I see when I look through the sight. As you can see, I like it thin, really thin. And I also like the crosshair styled aperture to help with my approach to the target, but more on that in another video. I'm not sure if this guy is still making apertures anymore, but if someone knows a skilled machinist who would like to partner and produce some more apertures like this, I'd love to connect with them. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about what you should be seeing when you look through the sights, and also the importance of sight alignment while shooting. If you enjoyed this video or you learned something, go ahead and hit the like button because it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and hopefully we can get more educational biathlon videos out for you soon. Thanks!